For an earlier chapter, my ageing memory was actually right, because Jim confirms Duff was a Catholic monk before his RIC service. I think it was after his shipwreck. Now, whether the shipwreck turned him in a profoundly religious direction for a brief period, I don't know, but it sounds like a story which would make a fantastic film. Pascal Donoghue mentioned the GAA at the start, and tomorrow there's an event, an All-Ireland hurling final in Croke Park. And one of the ghosts there will be a man mentioned by Jim Herlihy, namely Thomas McCarthy from Banshee, County Tipperary. And in accordance with the rules, he could not serve in South Riding. He was District Inspector in North Riding. He was a young man of 22 when the GAA was founded. His father was a Kerry man from Tralee and a District Inspector as well, which is one more example of the huge family tradition that was going on. But within 4 years, the year the first All-Ireland hurling final took place in 1888, 4 years after the founding, the ban came in. And the explanation goes back to the founding of the GAA itself, and of the 7 people credited with being present in Hayes' Hotel in Thurles on that occasion, one was a builder. I'm not uttering that term with any prejudice from recent years in this country, a builder and a Fenian called Joseph Bracken. And in the amazing twists of Irish history, his son Brendan was a close friend of Churchill and his Minister for Information during World War II. It reminds me of the line of Louis MacNeice in one of his poems, the drunkenness of things being various. And the history of Ireland and the history of the RIC can be summed up in that line of MacNeice, the drunkenness of things being various. But the influence of Bracken, the IRB man of the 7 who were present, turned out to be the decisive influence on the GAA, not the presence of an RIC District Inspector. And as Jim pointed out, he was an enthusiast for rugby. My recollection was that in fact he was capped for Ireland, that he played for Ireland against Wales as well as playing rugby in Tipperary and for Trinity and for Cusack's team, that he actually was capped against Wales. But in any event, before the GAA was founded, he was a man who was mad about sports. And the founding people of the GAA, Maurice Davin from Carrick-on-Suir, who was a great athlete, and Michael Cusack, were people passionate about sport, not about using the GAA or sport as a weapon in an armed conspiracy or in any revolution, whereas Bracken was. And the influence of Bracken led to the 2 bans, the ban on the RIC only 4 years after the founding, and the ban then on the so-called foreign games, which meant that somebody like McCarthy was doubly hit, being a lover of rugby and being in the RIC. They were doubly excluded. And that ethos continues on. And talking of poetry, when Seamus Heaney died recently, the BBC opened up within a few lines at the start of their obituary on him in terms of the line of his, I'm not sure what year it was written about, no glass of ours was ever raised to toast the Queen. And I thought there's a missing line underneath that which could run, no glass of ours was raised to toast the boys in Bottle Green, murdered or maimed boys in Bottle Green. Now Seamus didn't write that, but the real question about the ambiguous line about not toasting the Queen is where you stand on the maiming and murder of the boys in Bottle Green. And I think Tip O'Neill once remarked that all politics is local. Well, also so is all history. Not that you only tell the local stories, but a general story means nothing if you cannot flesh it out and show how it actually describes the reality on the ground. And for me, the story of the boys in Bottle Green is also a personal story. I have 2 reservations about the RIC. My great-grandfather joined it and died at 45, and his oldest son died at 50. So I sincerely hope whatever particular gene went through that part of the RIC has not passed on down to me. Luckily, I've passed those 2 milestones, and hopefully I will continue on for a long time. The younger one spent 6 years in the RIC in Limerick City, and at that stage the ratio of officers to Limerick City population was 23 for 10,000 of the population. Obviously, he did a much better job than has been done in recent years in Limerick City, where they need a ratio of about 10 times that to deal with some of the problems there. He then went after 6 years to Australia. But Jim mentioned that if you had a father in the force, you got a year off the age. Well, he did an awful lot better. He didn't come in at 18, he got in at 16. Now, I suspect that everything was known about everybody by the constabulary, and he was living just 6 miles from Kilkenny City, where the county inspector was, the district inspector was based. I have no doubt that his age was very well known, and I suspect if there was no official, there was certainly must have been an unofficial doctoring of the record to let him in at only 16. He was of full height or more, so he probably looked okay, but I'm very grateful that whoever looked over the records didn't pay a very careful attention to the literally following the rules. At that stage, the county headquarters in my native city of Kilkenny was in Parliament Street, and in 1940 my father was based there in the Garda Station Party, and he told me with horror when the internment of the IRA was coming in. He had two lists of the IRA. He had those who were the Republicans and those who were the effing Republicans who would shoot you in the back. And he had a very definite, clear categorisation of them into those two camps. And on the list that came down was a publican called Paddy Gleeson in Kilkenny, who later became political, who joined Clonard who stood for election, became mayor of the city. And my father was very firmly convinced that this man definitely was one of the hanger-on Republicans, not the thugs who would shoot you in the back. And he was on the list. It wasn't local knowledge that put him on the list. Whether it was political or whether it was crime 3 in headquarters or both, I don't know, but it certainly was not local knowledge. And it came back to me doing some research in the census. The president of the GAA for 20 years, the only man to ever hold the office for that long term of time, was James Nolan, who came from the same street and the same side of the street as I came from in Kilkenny City. And Nolan was a man in his 50s, and he was interned in 1916. Now, when I knew the numbers interned, I presumed automatically I knew the numbers who took part in the rising, so therefore they got most or all of them. I'm not aware that the lists of those interned were as dubious as that, but it must have been a massive PR own goal to include the GAA president in the list of those interned. Nothing happened in Kilkenny before 1916. Nothing happened in 1916, and very little happened in 1919 to 21 in the county. And Ernie O'Malley came at one stage to try and stir things up, and wasn't exactly a huge success in that. So there was a very zealous county inspector, a Catholic incidentally from County Meath, called Piers Power, who was in Kilkenny around that era and for most of the troubles afterwards. Now, whether he was more influential or not, but I can't imagine that a decision to intern the GAA president would have been unnoticed or would not have been carefully considered and vetted, not only in the Crime Branch Special Office in Dublin Castle, but a great deal, and possibly by the civil or political administration of the day. And as a known goal in terms of creating problems and adding to problems, that strikes me as one spectacular one. There was also a large number of others. His nephew was picked up, and another young lad from the same street. But what's interesting in looking at the census on that particular street, that small street and the two ones beside it was riddled with peelers. There was a sergeant and 2 constables and 3 pensioners living either there or in the adjoining streets, and the small number of houses. So everything that happened in that small locality in my native city was absolutely known, and the pensioners reported every month when they got their pension. And I didn't just talk about the weather, they reported back to the district headquarters. And the district headquarters and county headquarters were only a few yards down the street as well. So the idea that there was no knowledge, local knowledge, would have been absolutely superb. And in fact, at the time of the rising, there were over 8,300, I think, pensioners around the country who were a huge additional resource in terms of eyes and ears for the constabulary. And as I think Jim MacDonald talked about the failure to coordinate the two forces, the DMP and the RIC. It's fascinating when you look at the RIC list for even 1920. The total lack of resources to the intelligence field that existed. There was a tiny office in Dublin Castle. There was a county inspector and a handful there who were coordinating and dealing with intelligence, and you had the crucial role of sergeants in each county around the country, providing the eyes and ears in effect, but no further specialised operation being carried out, or nothing on the lines of the G Division, even in the Dublin Metropolitan Division. So the amateurishness of it was unbelievable. Indeed, the British Army, when they became involved, arrived having dismantled their intelligence structure, which they had built up during World War I. So when they needed something like that, and particularly coming in as outsiders, they arrived blind, but in a situation in which the self-defeating aspect of having no proper structure nor developing one is mind-blowing. And I remember a conversation with John Gorman, a very interesting character. He was a district inspector in the RIC. He won a military cross in 1944 in Normandy. His father served as an ex-army officer. John then went into the RUC from the Irish Guards. His father had been in the British Army and was the last commandant of the training depot in the Phoenix Park in 1922. He went north. He became county inspector in County Derry, from which place Borden, the first Catholic chief inspector general of the RIC, had come. And a fascinating example of the way in which the family tradition. John's son and grandson served in the Irish Guards as well. So to situate the RIC story, I think one part of it is the huge reality of what you might call loyal Ireland, which was absolutely massive. In 1916, the post office was seized and other buildings by a tiny fringe. Not even 2,000 are believed to have taken part during the week in that rising. At that stage, where did Ireland stand? It's amazing you have had the combination of silence and demonisation of the RIC, particularly relating to those years, and yet the reality was very, very interesting. You had the National Volunteers loyal to Redmond reaching a peak strength of the highest estimates of something like 180 or 90,000. Some estimates suggest less than that. You had the Ulster Volunteers in the north with anything up to 90,000 at their peak. You had a huge number, 200,000 serving in the British forces during World War I. Some of that is double counting because some of them were serving in the National Volunteers or the Irish Volunteers. But the huge preponderance of mobilised Ireland between the RIC, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, the British Army and Navy, and then eventually the Royal Air Force, the two sets of constitutional volunteers, the massive preponderance was overwhelmingly in one direction, of peaceful politics, whereas the armed revolutionaries were a tiny fringe. And the way history has been rewritten subsequently was that the RIC have been written out. Over the last number of years, there's been a lot of activity, a lot of writing, a lot of attention paid to Irishmen in the British forces. In November 97, the foundation was laid in Flanders, in Messines, for around Tower. And the following year, it was opened by President Mary McAleese and by Queen Elizabeth, and which commemorated when the 16th Irish and 36th Ulster Division fought together at that spot. That hasn't happened in regard to the history of the RIC. You've had a huge amount of work done by various people, and Jim Herlihy, I had never met Jim before. I expected to see somebody who was a physical wreck, because if you've done the amount of research, which obviously Jim has done, I expected that you would be an absolute, total suffer from amnesia or whatever. He has done a massive amount of work. And I may later come on to mention one or two particular stories which are worth highlighting from his work. But that work has happened. There have been various other books, but two things have not happened. The story of the British Army is being researched locally. There's a huge, massive volume produced in my native county recently on Irish men in World War I, and it goes into massive detail. It's on the same calibre and scale of the work Jim has done. For example, his last thing on RIC officers, that took donkey's years to produce. That's been happening. It's not been done locally, again, by people around the country for the RIC, the way it has been done, say, for service in the British Army. And also at national level. When Tom Burke of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers Association got a, I think, MBE from Her Majesty some years ago, Bertie Ahern threw a reception in Dublin Castle. Again, when the Round Tower project was underway, Mary McAleese, whose own personal background was in North Belfast, and in a very Republican background part of North Belfast, the view on the other side was that Paddy Lenihan's bar was the officers' mess of the 3rd Battalion, Ardyne Battalion of the Provo IRA, and Mary travelled a very long journey in her political life and her personal life. But that process of national recognition of the khaki as being a story about the orange and green has not yet happened at national level in the same way in regard to the bottle green. And in fact, the bottle green story is a very interesting one, because those who served in World War I overwhelmingly served for a few years. The RIC were lifers for the vast part, and they came in and they served for the full career. So you have absolutely massively in excess of 2 million man-years of service delivered in the era of the RIC by Irish men. But an interesting thing struck me many years ago, about 97, whenever Jim Herlihy's first book came out, reading through the list of casualties, and again when Richard Abbott produced his book later on, it struck me that this was not being described fully, and certainly what I grew up with did not describe it, because it was a class war. The big farmers or strong farmers' sons in Munster were very prominent in shooting down the guys. And who were they shooting down? Well, Tom Crean got a lot of publicity, the petty officer of the Royal Navy, who was the famous Antarctic explorer. His brother, Sergeant Conn, was an RIC sergeant in County Cork, a Kerry man, and Con Crean was shot down. Now, I doubt if Con Crean was any more an alien oppressor of the Irish race than was his brother, petty officer Tom Crean. And yet the Tom Creans of our land were written out of history and ignored. And the reality that there was no war of independence, there was a Dublin and Munster war, and that in particular there was this class element, that those who died to a disproportionate extent were, as the RIC were, farmers' sons, but particularly so many of them from the west of Ireland. But the reality of the RIC, again, is absolutely fascinating. When you look at the 1911 census, look at the various Belfast barracks of the RIC, you find something amazing. And I took an example, the most unlikely one of all of them, Brown Square Barracks in the heart of Belfast, which policed the Shankill and the Woodvale area of Belfast, the most true blue loyalist part of Belfast you could find. In 1911, it is 31% Catholic, the station party there of 29. 55% overall were from the south. The rest of them were either, all the Catholics I think were Southern Catholics. The other Southerners were Protestant. Almost all of them were actually Church of Ireland. So the most true blue loyalist heartland in Belfast around the Shankill and Woodvale was policed by 55% of Southerners. And that also reminds me too, the same pattern by the way is found by and large if you look at the census for every other RIC barracks across Belfast. But particularly intrigued me too was a man, Richard Harrison. Republican propaganda, then as now, has been absolutely world-class, unbeatable, outstanding, and rarely scrutinised. And Harrison was the subject of Republican propaganda, vague innuendo, but nothing definite. Okay, I'm biased being a Kilkenny man, but Harrison came from the other side of the river, a short distance where I was born, on one side of the military barracks. And just beside the military barracks, there was another man, a Cork man, or from a Cork family rather, a young man called Liam Tobin. Tobin was born in 1895. Richard Harrison, who was the son of a DI, again this pattern which happened so often, was born in 1883. And Tobin went to school along the banks of the river. Around the corner was the school where Richard Harrison went, Kilkenny College, which was then in John Street, and right beside it was the John Street sub-district of the RIC. Now, unless young Tobin threw a stone at Harrison when Harrison was going to school, and unless Harrison clattered him, I don't know why a young lad in Kilkenny growing up in a city that was peaceful very much, in which there was certainly no sectarian tradition, how he ends up as the key figure under Collins in the Volunteers intelligence operation in Dublin, and a very major figure in that. It's a fascinating question. One angle on Harrison which fascinated me was, which I got from Eamon Phoenix, the historian in Belfast. Phoenix knew James Kelly, who was a leading writer, journalist with the Irish News in Belfast. And I didn't know, but Kelly lived to be about 100. His father was an RIC man from Kilkenny and a contemporary of Richard Harrison. And the take which James Kelly had, which Phoenix relayed to me, was that he had huge admiration for Harrison as he was the city commissioner in Belfast in the 1930s. He joined as a district inspector. In 1920 he became a county inspector and for a period was staff officer of the Special Constabulary, and then he became city commissioner in charge of Belfast. And in the 1930s, mid-1930s, where you had rioting going on, he was a very firm and effective figure in the view of James Kelly, who would certainly not have been liable to be going soft on loyalist writers in 1935 or 36. He had said he had huge admiration for the way, in fact, in which Harrison, as the city commander, operated against that situation at that point, which leads me to wonder whether the Republican attempt to smear Harrison in terms of reprisals and so on as an earlier era was anything other than more brilliant propaganda. But it does fascinate me to look at how men, literally a few yards apart, can end up in such different contexts. And furthermore, when there wasn't such a huge tradition, the IRB tradition took over the GAA. Again, that makes total sense at one level. Who wants to attend meeting after meeting? Fanatics probably do. I think in some trade unions, in secondary teachers, for example, I think that the line they've taken in this country indicates people who attend meetings are not representative. So the IRB, if they were fanatical, would attend meeting after meeting, would readily get control of any organisation, which they did. The GAA was the first, the Gaelic League subsequently, the Irish Volunteers again. The small element, the Irish Volunteers, a huge mass movement, the IRB got control of it. Just talking to Dermot before I started, he mentioned that the RIC had huge files on the GAA and they divided them into the bulk of areas where they were, the clergy may have been influential, or which they were genuine sporting, and a small area where there might have been strong IRB influence. Well, at national level, the rule changes, certainly, the huge influence of the IRB took place, and considering it took so long for the rule change to happen, for the reversal of the ban on the RUC and the reversal of the ban on so-called foreign games, that was unchallenged for so long is absolutely amazing. And I thought of the unchallenged history, and I disagree with Pascal's opening phrase about history, because the absence of history, in fact, means not no history, it means wrong history. It means history as a tool of those who have got a very different agenda. And I think that makes it all the more sinister if history is not properly taught and explored and formed in our schools. And I thought of a line of MacNeice. In 1939, MacNeice produced a poem, Autumn Journal, with the following lines. The land of saints and scholars my eye, the land of ambush. And that related, I think, to his own family story. MacNeice's first cousin was a Sergeant Frizzell, and in violation of the truce and the treaty, Frizzell was a police sergeant around the loop on the shores of Lough Neagh when he was gunned down along with a special constable in 1922. So it was very personal when MacNeice penned those lines. And it's interesting, the Frizzell story. When I was growing up in Kilkenny, there was a woman in the post office, a post office clerk, whose build would have got her into the RIC. In fact, I knew that she was the daughter of the head constable who retired in late 1916 there. What I didn't discover until much more recently was that he came from Sligo. And Louis MacNeice's cousin, the sergeant, who was gunned down for no particular reason other than the bottle green he wore, he was the third generation. His father was an RIC man. His grandfather was a Limerick-born RIC sergeant in Mayo. And again, there's a pattern of not only family history, but a pattern very much of people being singled out for wearing that uniform. And my final point is, I don't simply think of commemorating them. I stand with pride in the phrase which Sean McEntee, Fianna Fáil Taoiseach, I think, referred at one stage to Noel Brown as a peeler's get. His father was an RIC sergeant, which Brown never wanted to mention and refused to mention it in his autobiography. Well, I stand with pride on that because the laws enforced were substantially carried on by the new Irish state. The enforcement of that, particularly as time went on, was by a force which was technically armed. When they changed carbines in 1899, the report in the House of Commons said in the previous decade their carbines had been used on 14 occasions. That was more an unarmed than an armed force. So the image of this heavily armed force, in fact, has little reality. The people who formed it, people came from this country, the people of this country, orange and green, but massively from the Catholic tribe, and particularly farmers' sons, as you find amazingly when you look even at the Belfast station parties in the 1911 census. I think that the task today facing people in this room and facing this country is to recognise that we've had for many years a National Day of Commemoration in July, honouring Irish men who served in different armies. We need a National Day of Commemoration honouring the story of Irish policing. Carl O'Callaghan, the Commissioner in Western Australia, is the 5th Irishman to head that force. Ray Kelly, the Commissioner of the NYPD in New York. Peter Fahey, Chief Constable today in Manchester. The list goes on and on. The story is one story. The RIC are one chapter in a story of honourable service, of distinguished service, and of courage. And I think that it needs to be told, and told as part of that, and something to be absolutely, unhesitatingly proud of, and as part of the diaspora. And also, I'm particularly proud too that my great uncle, who learned this policing in Limerick in the RIC, went on, and tragically he died at only 50 as an inspector in Australia. So I hope I don't follow that. But I think we all have a story to tell. And if we don't tell that story, we not only dishonour our family history, we dishonour the Irish diaspora and the pride which we should have in the values and principles and decency which all branches of Irish policing, the Gardaí, the RUC, the RIC and abroad around the world, is something which is hugely part of our Irish identity and story.